When the first officers stepped into the little house on Merritt Way, they thought they were ready. They weren't. The living room was silent, no sign of a struggle. Groceries still on the counter. A cartoon playing on the TV, no one was watching. Down the hallway, a detective called out, voice shaking, "You need to see this." Now, what they found in the bedroom would be described later as a house of carnage, a scene so disturbing that seasoned investigators had to step outside to regain their composure. A mother, a child, a toddler, all brutally murdered. And the killer had vanished into suburbia. Over the next hours, Sacramento would learn that this was not an isolated attack. It was the work of a man the media would come to call the Vampire of Sacramento. A man who believed he was dying unless he consumed blood. A man whose crimes would blur the line between murder case and waking nightmare. This is the story of Richard Trenton Chase, serial killer cannibal necrophile, and how in the span of just 1 month he turned ordinary homes into crime scenes and a quiet California city into a place where no unlocked door felt safe again. To understand how a man becomes the Vampire of Sacramento, we have to go back before the headlines. Before the fear to a boy born in California in 1950, Richard Trenton Chase grew up in a home where discipline often meant physical punishment, and arguments were part of the daily soundtrack. His parents' marriage was turbulent, marked by accusations, paranoia, and emotional instability. By the time Richard was 10, he was already showing the classic signs that appear again and again in the histories of violent offenders: cruelty to animals, setting fires, persistent bedwetting. A pattern known as the McDonald Triad, sometimes associated with later violent behavior. In school, Richard looked like any other kid on the surface. But inside, his mind was already turning in unsettling directions. He developed bizarre fantasies about power and identity, imagining himself as an outlaw, pasting his face over photos of famous gunfighters. As he grew older, the odd behaviors escalated. Richard became withdrawn, experimented heavily with drugs, and struggled with relationships. He complained of strange physical symptoms, insisting that his heart was shrinking, that his blood was disappearing, that parts of his body were changing shape. In December 1973, Chase walked into an emergency room in a panic, claiming that his blood had stopped flowing and that his heart was failing. Doctors admitted him to the psychiatric unit. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and staff described him as tense, disheveled, and deeply disturbed. But like so many stories in mental health and public safety, this one followed a tragic script. Richard was released against medical advice. Over the next few years, his delusions only deepened. He became obsessed with the idea that his body was wasting away. He fixated on blood, believing it could restore him, that he needed it to survive. He began killing animals, drinking their blood, and even attempting to inject animal blood into his veins. The result was blood poisoning and another involuntary commitment to a psychiatric facility. Inside that institution, staff nicknamed him Dracula. He talked about conspiracies, aliens, and poison. He talked about blood, a lot. But once again, he was eventually released. Medication that could have helped him was tapered off at home. By early 1977, Richard Chase was back in Sacramento, and no longer taking his prescribed drugs. In his small apartment, neighbors began to notice strange things: the smell, the sounds of gunshots, the constant presence and disappearance of neighborhood pets. Richard bought a .22 caliber handgun and spent hours firing it into the walls, claiming he was shooting at voices only he could hear. He bought rabbits, dogs, and other animals and took them inside. The animals never seemed to come out again. By the end of 1977, one deeply delusional man was living alone in Sacramento, convinced that something was stealing his blood and that he needed to replace it. And then, on December 29th, he stepped out of the shadows and into the public record. It was just after Christmas, December 29th, 1977. 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, an engineer and father of two, was helping his wife bring in groceries at their Sacramento home. It was a simple, ordinary moment until it wasn't. A car rolled slowly down the street. A gun barrel emerged, almost casually. 2 shots cracked the winter air. Mrs. Griffin watched her husband stagger and collapse. For a moment, she thought he was having a heart attack. But the truth was worse. He had been killed by a random shot from a passing vehicle. Police were baffled. No apparent motive. No robbery. Just a quiet man gunned down in front of his home. It felt senseless. It felt like a one-off. It wasn't. Over the next weeks, Chase began testing a method he would later describe to FBI profiler Robert Ressler. He walked through neighborhoods, trying front doors. If the door was locked, he took it as a sign he wasn't welcome. If it was unlocked, he believed it was an invitation. He broke into homes when people weren't there, stealing items, urinating on clothes, defecating on beds. It was as if he was rehearsing, moving closer and closer to what he would eventually do. January 23, 1978. 22-year-old Teresa Terry Wallen was home alone. She was 3 months pregnant and spending a quiet day doing housework and errands while her husband was at work. She took a bag of trash out to the garbage. She left the front door unlocked. Richard Chase, wandering the neighborhood, saw his chance. He walked in. Teresa stepped back inside from the yard and found herself face to face with a stranger pointing a .22 caliber handgun. He fired. One shot hit her hand as she raised it instinctively. Another tore into her head. She fell to the floor. He fired again, killing her. What happened next is among the most disturbing episodes in American true crime. We won't linger on graphic detail, but the basics matter for understanding the investigation. Richard dragged Teresa's body into the bedroom. There, he sexually assaulted her body, mutilated her with a knife from the kitchen, and used a container from her trash to collect and drink her blood. Later forensic examination showed that internal organs had been removed and rearranged. Before leaving, he desecrated her body in a final act of cruelty. Her husband, David, returned home that evening, expecting an ordinary night. Instead, he walked into a nightmare, finding his wife's body and calling the police in hysterics. A young family destroyed in seconds by a man they had never met. 4 days later, the violence escalated. January 27, 1978. Inside a modest home, 36-year-old Evelyn Mirath was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira. Her 6-year-old son Jason was there, along with a family friend, Dan Meredith, who had stopped by to check in. Outside, Chase was prowling again. He found Evelyn's door unlocked. When he entered, Dan Meredith was near the front door. Richard shot him almost immediately, then turned his gun on the others in the house. Jason, little David, and Evelyn herself. All were fatally shot. What followed was another scene of extreme mutilation and necrophilia. Evelyn's body was moved, violated, and partially cannibalized. The bathtub was later found filled with blood-tinged water. The baby David was taken from the house entirely. In a quiet, almost cinematic twist of fate, a neighbor's little girl, Tracy, came to the house during the crime to see if her friend Jason was ready for a planned outing to the snow. She knocked. No one answered. Something felt wrong. Her mother, sensing unease, led her away and alerted a neighbor. That neighbor called the police. When officers entered, they were confronted with the scene we opened this video with, what one detective described as the worst crime scene he had ever encountered, especially because a child lay among the dead. 6-year-old Jason was found dressed in his new clothes for the day trip he would never take. The baby David was missing. Given the condition of the house, detectives feared the worst. In under a month, a random drive-by shooting, the horrific murder of a pregnant young woman in her home, and now a quadruple killing with a missing toddler. The question hanging over everything: who was doing this and how could they be stopped before they struck again? From the start, investigators noticed disturbing similarities between the Wallen and Mirath scenes. The use of a .22 caliber weapon, the level of mutilation, evidence of blood consumption, and crucially, clear footprints and handprints left in blood at the Mirath residence. These weren't careful, calculated crimes. They were chaotic and frenzied, but they also suggested a pattern. Someone was entering homes through unlocked doors, targeting entire households, and fixating on blood. Forensic teams matched ballistic evidence from the Griffin shooting to the weapon used at the later scenes. What had once looked like a random drive-by was now the first act in a spree. The case quickly drew the attention of behavioral profilers, including FBI agent Robert Ressler, who would later become famous for his work defining and studying serial killers. Looking at the evidence, profilers suggested a suspect who was young, white, severely mentally ill, disorganized, and very likely living in the area. He didn't bother to hide his tracks. He left fingerprints, footprints, and an abundance of physical evidence. That suggested someone who was delusional, acting compulsively rather than strategically. The critical break in the case didn't come from a high-tech lab. It came from a tip. Shortly before Teresa Wallen's murder, Richard Chase had approached an old acquaintance, Nancy, in a shopping area. She was shocked by his appearance. Underweight, pale, disheveled, with a vacant stare. When he asked her for a ride, she refused, locking her car doors and driving away. After the Meerut murders made headlines, she recognized his face from composite descriptions and called the police. Detectives ran his name. What they found set off alarms. A documented history of severe mental illness, prior psychiatric commitments, a recent firearms purchase, reports of disturbing behavior involving neighborhood pets. Richard Trenton Chase suddenly moved from background oddity to prime suspect. On January 28, 1978, the day after the Meerut murders, officers went to Chase's apartment. They knew he was dangerous and armed, and they still didn't know where baby David was, or whether he was alive. They knocked. No answer. So they used a tactic as old as policing itself. They pretended to leave. Standing just out of sight, they waited. Within minutes, the door opened. Richard Chase stepped out, carrying a box. He saw the officers, froze, and then bolted. He didn't get far. The box he dropped contained blood-stained rags and paper. He was handcuffed and taken into custody. At the station, Chase was initially evasive. He admitted to killing animals but denied involvement in the murders, rambling instead about being framed, about conspiracies, about people entering and leaving his apartment to set him up. If there had been any doubt, it vanished when investigators searched his apartment. Detectives found blood on the walls, floor, ceiling, and furniture. Blood in the kitchen sink and refrigerator. Cups, bowls, and utensils stained with old blood. Several pet collars and remains of animals. Newspapers and magazines about guns, UFOs, and psychology. A calendar where the dates of the Wallen and Meerut murders were simply marked today. It was the physical reflection of the mind they'd just arrested. Chaotic, paranoid, fixated on blood, and steeped in delusion. Later, the remains of baby David Ferreira were found in a box dumped behind a church. The worst fears of investigators had been confirmed. Between the physical evidence at the scenes, the ballistic matches, and the horrific state of his apartment, prosecutors were confident they had their killer. But the story wasn't over. Now came the question that would dominate the courtroom. Was Richard Chase evil or insane? In 1979, Richard Chase went on trial for 6 counts of first-degree murder. With special circumstances in a Sacramento courtroom, prosecutors sought the death penalty. The defense argued for a verdict of second-degree murder on grounds of diminished capacity, hoping for life in prison instead. Chase's long history of psychiatric problems became central to the case. Defense attorneys described his paranoid schizophrenia, his delusions about poisoned food and stolen organs, his belief that he needed blood to live. They portrayed him as a profoundly sick man whose crimes were the result of untreated mental illness, not calculated evil. In jail, he refused to eat at times, complaining that his meals were poisoned. He asked his lawyer to have the food tested in a lab. It wasn't. Prosecutors, however, focused on a different angle: legal sanity. They pointed out that Chase had lied about his mental health to purchase a handgun, brought rubber gloves with him, tried to avoid detection when leaving scenes, fled in a victim's car. These, they argued, were signs that he understood what he was doing and that he knew it was wrong. One prosecutor later said he believed the case would be an uphill battle, convincing a jury that a man who mutilated victims and drank blood could nonetheless be legally sane. But several psychiatrists who evaluated Chase agreed. Despite his severe psychosis, he could distinguish right from wrong. During the trial, Chase himself gave chillingly flat responses. At one point he said, "I didn't kill anybody. Just a few people." It was the kind of statement that left the courtroom in uneasy silence. Family members of the victims testified, including Teresa Wallen's husband, who described walking into his home and finding his wife's body. The human cost of the crimes was laid bare. After deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense. On May 8, 1979, they found Richard Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. In San Quentin, even hardened inmates were disturbed by Chase's crimes. Many kept their distance. Some reportedly tried to persuade him to take his own life so the state wouldn't have to. He continued to behave erratically, talking about UFOs, conspiracies, and secret plots against him. At one point, he asked to be moved closer to Washington, D.C., believing he needed to be near the federal government for protection from aliens. On December 26, 1980, guards found Richard Chase dead in his cell. He had hoarded and ingested a massive overdose of Sinequan, an antidepressant he'd been prescribed. Officially, his death was ruled as suicide, though some have speculated he might have simply been trying to silence the voices in his head. He was 30 years old. For Sacramento, the case left deep scars. In the wake of the murders, everyday habits changed. People locked doors that had always been left open. Neighbors checked on each other more often. Parents pulled their children closer. The idea that a stranger could walk into an unlocked home and destroy an entire family seemingly at random shook the community. A sense of safety. For law enforcement and mental health professionals, the Chase case became a grim reference point in discussions about the intersection of severe psychosis, early warning signs, and violent crime. FBI profilers studied his behavior as an example of a disorganized, psychotic serial killer whose crimes were driven less by traditional motives like greed or revenge, and more by delusion and disturbed ritual. Richard Chase's story is, in one sense, the story of a monster, a man whose crimes were so depraved that he seemed almost inhuman. But beneath the horror is another story, a troubled child showing clear signs of distress, a young man repeatedly reaching crisis points, an adult whose delusions were documented, diagnosed, and then released back into the world again and again. None of this removes his responsibility. None of it lessens the pain of the families who lost Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallen, Evelyn Meredith, Jason, and little David. But it does force us to ask difficult questions. How many warnings have to pile up before someone is kept in treatment long enough to be truly safe? Where is the line between personal accountability and system failure? And what does justice look like when the person on trial lives in a reality so fractured that he believes blood is the only thing keeping his heart beating? In the end, the vampire of Sacramento died not in the gas chamber, but alone in a prison cell, swallowed by the same darkness that had driven his crimes. The families he devastated live with the consequences every day. The city he terrorized remembers the weeks when an unlocked door felt like an invitation to death. And the case remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the most frightening monsters are not supernatural at all. They're human. Lock your doors. Know your neighbors. And remember, evil doesn't always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it just turns the handle and walks right in.